1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Kym Milne. Kym is an Adelaide Hills-based MW and winemaking consultant who helped take Villa Maria from receivership to poster child of New Zealand fine wine before conquering the world as a flying winemaker. Kym and I spoke about the farm boy who reared calves to beef up his piggy bank to buy a motorbike, starting out in the days of Australian Chablis, Moselle, Claret and Burgundy, and when Chardonnay was a brand new thing. Rusty machinery, iron curtains and gold medals from Eastern Europe. What fashion dictates and what dictates fashion in the consumer sphere? Teetotal forebears and winemaker offspring. How 18 months overseas turned into 20 years in the air. Putting the Boz into Stellenbosch. How he learned to love the Bombino Bianco. The ins and outs of offies and UK supermarket wheeler dealing. The lie of the land of the Adelaide Hills. How a punt on far-flung projects went from 0 to 2 million cases of wine. And swapping air miles for 2,000-kilometre treks in search of a quieter life. I started by asking what young Kym got up to before he took flight.
Okay, so I grew up near a small town called Mundalla in the southeast of South Australia. Bordertown would be more well known, which is the next larger town nearby. It was a small family farm. I think I was fairly quiet sort of kid, mad on sport and all the normal things that country kids are.
Were you particularly proficient in any of them?
I was 100% for effort and sort of 50-60% for talent, I think.
What about at school? Were you conscientious?
Yeah, I was. When I was young, my mother taught me to read before I went to school, so I think it's a bit of a sort of family story that I read the grade 1 primer to the headmaster on my first day of school or something. Whether it's a true story or not, I'm not sure. But so I did very well at school. My parents split up when I was in my early teens, and I think it was about the same time the hormones were kicking in. So I think my years at high school were probably much less diligent than my primary school years.
And were you quite outdoorsy in general? Were you into the sort of farm country life?
Yeah, I suppose I was. Yeah, I used to spend a lot of time out chasing a football and helping on the farm and stuff. Actually, when I was quite young, Mum used to raise calves and then sell them, for sort of her pocket money, I suppose. And when she left when I was about 13, I took that over. So I used to get up and mix up the milk powder and feed the calves in the morning and do that sort of stuff before I went to school. So yeah, it was quite a country sort of existence. Dad was very generous. I used to have to buy the milk powder and feed the calves, but then they got free grazing and hay from then on, and then when they were sold, the money went into my bank account. So I sort of learnt the value of doing a bit of work and earning some money fairly early on.
Yeah, and sucked into a full sense of security where you were making some profit from farming.
Yeah, no, it was being fairly generously helped by my father, but such to the point that when I got to 16 years old, I had enough money to buy a motorbike, and Dad was pretty loose in that respect, so he just let me buy it. Actually, in those days, there was no restriction on size you could get, so I bought a very fast Yamaha RD 350 off my cousin, and I was 16 years old. I probably would have been barely over 5 foot tall and weighed about, 60 kilos. I mean, I could only just lift the thing up, but it went like a rocket, actually. I was lucky to survive, I think.
And like many country kids in small country towns, were you sort of itching to ride that Yamaha out into the sunset and explore the wider world? Yeah,
I think my last 2 years at school, I used to ride it to school, so I stopped going on the school bus. And then I took a gap year after I finished school, and I chucked a backpack I bought a frame for the back of the bike with a backpack on, and I went travelling for about 3 months, I suppose, just up the east coast of Australia. I think I got as far as Mackay, or just north of Mackay, just with a little tent on the back and travelling. Yeah, no, it was interesting times.
Yeah, right. Well, I guess that kind of set the scene a little bit for what's been a very well-travelled career since then. But where did wine kind of come into the picture for you?
Yeah, interesting, actually. My family was generally teetotal. All my grandparents were teetotal for religious reasons, and a lot of my uncles and aunties were teetotal. My mother and father, before Mum left, were pretty much teetotal, but then when Mum left, when Dad remarried a few years later, wine sort of came into the house. But I think my first introduction was with my mother and stepfather. He very much liked a glass of red, and I think probably going out in Adelaide to, I think I've got a vague memory of something called the Archibus Steakhouse, going there and first tasting a glass of red wine and thinking it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I was probably about 14, I think. And I think I always, ever since that, just sort of piqued a bit of interest. And going through school was a chemistry teacher that I remember when we were doing organic chem, he talked about winemakers needing to stop the alcohol going to acetaldehyde going to vinegar, and I always remember that and thought, no, that sounds pretty interesting. So yeah, took the gap year, went away on the motorbike for a while, worked back home on the farm for a while, and then through my mother, who was living in the Riverland, got a job in the cellar at Berry Winery, which was the biggest sort of single-site winery in the day, working as a cellar hand. And I'd enrolled and been accepted in a science degree, which I'd deferred for a year, and I worked in the cellar in the winery and saw what the winemakers did and thought that's a hell of a lot more interesting than other options I'd looked at, which was food technology and various other things, and reapplied for the winemaking course and got accepted. So it sort of went from there, really.
At Roseworthy, we've had several guests with influential educators and peers there. I believe that during your time there, you had Bryce Rankin and the recently departed Richard Smart among your educators. What were they like to learn under?
Yeah, good. I think Richard, obviously, incredibly passionate about viticulture. I mean, if I'm honest, I rose with the years. I was as much about the party as I was about the wine, to some extent. But I think Richard thought our year was a bit of a rabble, really. But no, he was quite inspirational. Certainly learnt a lot from him. For the amount of units that the viticulture subjects were, I think there were 3 units or something, you had to do more work than some of the 5 and 6 unit subjects. Like, he really pushed and provided an enormous amount of information. So yeah, no, he's quite inspirational. Bryce, we generally had, I think he was the head of the course. I think we had him for wine tasting, basically. That's all I recall with him. Yeah, quite an interesting character.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about Richard and the viticultural thrust for that course under his influence, because I suppose we've had an assumption that there was a really big accent in Australian winemaking education on making and technical stuff. That's talked about a lot more now, that viticultural side. So does it feel like that gave you some kind of edge?
Yeah, I think the Roseworthy course was a good education. You know, the wine technology side of it was very sound. I think Andrew Hewitt was the main lecturer there, and I think generally it was a good course. We were the first year I did it was the first year it was a degree status course. I think before that it was diploma status. So we had to there was probably an increase in the basic science. I think most of our first year microbiology and wine chemistry and stuff was essentially the same as first year science at uni. So, you know, you really only got into the sort of wine side of things in the second and third year.
Right. And you say that you were more about the party in those days. You must have somehow managed to get yourself noticed for your abilities. So how did that come about and what did it lead to?
So when I worked in the cellar up at Berry Winery before I went to college, well, I think I've always had a pretty solid work ethic, and coming off a farm, I found working in the cellar there quite interesting. A lot of the older guys would sort of set the filter up and get the pump running and then sort of hide behind the tank for a few hours or, you know, a couple of hours while the tank filtered, whereas I'd be constantly going up saying, I've got that going, what can I do next, you know? So I think I probably impressed them with sort of enthusiasm and work ethic, etc. So I then approached them about whether I could get some form of sponsorship through the course. They had a new general manager who was quite open-minded, so I was actually sponsored through the course by Berry Winery. I mean, it wasn't a lot of money, but they paid. I think in those days there was a tertiary assistance scheme, which, because I had 2 working parents, I for some reason didn't qualify for, so they paid the equivalent of what I would have got from the government scheme for me to do the course, and then I was bonded for 3 years to work for them after I left, which meant during the holidays I could go up and work. So when there was the midterm breaks and things at uni, I used to go home, visit my father on the farm for a week, and then do the other couple of weeks working in the cellar up at Berry. So it was, you know, I was doing practical stuff at the same time as studying, which was really good.
Okay, and what kind of wines were you making there? I'm really interested in the enormous array of wines that you've been involved in during your career to date. But at that stage of your life, at that stage of Berry, at that stage of the Riverland, what was the thrust of business?
So they were a big producer. They processed, I think in the second year I was there, we crushed 44,000 tonnes of grapes, which was the largest single-site crush in Australia at that time. I mean, the same winery now does over 200,000, just to put it in perspective. But they made an enormous array of things. It was a really good place to start, actually. A lot of cask wine, obviously. If people are old enough, they might remember Berry Estates, Fruity Gordo, Moselle, and and Chablis and Claret and Burgundy and all those things that the Australian industry can't make anymore. So there was a lot of high volume stuff, but we also made a lot of fortified. They had fortified stocks in barrel going back 30 years. So I remember at one stage selling a small tanker of 20-year-old muscat to a Rutherglen winery. We used to enter a lot of fortifieds in wine shows. We made ouzo, they made pot still brandy and continuous still brandy, and we made table wines like higher end. I think the first Chardonnay was made at Berry when I was there. Like Chardonnay was a brand new thing. We're talking quite a while ago. I was worked as a winemaker there from 81 to 83, so exposes my age. So, it was a great learning curve. There was 3 other winemakers there. I was the 4th, and Ian McKenzie was the head winemaker, who's, one of the top winemaking guys, one of the top Australian wine judges at the time and for many years after. So in terms of palate training and stuff, I'd been through Roseworthy, but having Ian go through a lineup of 50 Sultana ferments and get me to look at them first and say any issues with those, and then he'd go through it and push 3 of them back and he'd say have a look at those 3, so it was a terrific learning experience really. And we made all sorts of things, small volumes of blackberry nip and all sorts. We made Noy Prat ouzo under a contract for the French. We made quite a lot of fortified wine for other companies. I don't know if there used to be a big sherry brand, I don't even know if it still exists, called Three Roses Sherry. A vast amount of it was made at Berry, and they were absolutely meticulous. The alcohol had to be exactly correct and the sugar had to be exactly correct. So it was, quite interesting really. We even made a bit of floor sherry, actually. We had an underground cellar that we used to float floor on and make a very small volume of floor sherry each year. So we had the full range of fortifieds, floor sherry, Amontillado, Olorosos, huge quantities of cask wine, and then bottled Rieslings, reds, etc.
Yeah, everything under the sun,
yeah.
Sounds like. And are you a big fan of fortifieds to this day?
Yeah, I must admit I don't drink as much fortifieds perhaps as I would have then, but I still really like fortifieds. I, like many people, say how much I really like sherry, but then if I think about it, I probably don't drink that much of it.
And when Chardonnay was a new thing, how times have changed. And speaking of change, what was the thing that came next for you? So
after 3 years at Berry, I've always been keen on travel and seeing different things, learning new things. So a job came up in New Zealand. Actually, it was an assistant winemaker role at Villa Maria Winery. And my plan was go to New Zealand, do a couple of years there, go on and do a vintage in Europe and California and come back to Australia in a couple of years. So I applied and got the job at Villa as an assistant winemaker, and then did the 84 vintage there and the 85 vintage. And then in 85, the winemaker left and I got offered the winemaking role, and I was only in my mid-20s, and the chance to be the winemaker, the head winemaker for it was not the size Villa Maria is now, but it was about a 5,000-tonne crush family winery. It was just too good not to take up, so it was pretty exciting times. And New Zealand was just the main grape we crushed in my first vintage there was Mulaturgo, and 2 years later the main grapes we were crushing were Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. So, it was a time of change. There was a vine pull in New Zealand because they had a surplus. Villa Maria actually went into receivership. That was announced about 3 weeks after I was announced as the winemaker. I always say the two things weren't related, but whether the winemaker above me saw the writing on the wall and bailed, I'm not sure. But actually the receivership was a really interesting time. The receiver came in to Villa and said he'd never been involved in a receivership with a company that was run so tightly. There was no excess spending. It was really being run well. It was just the market conditions. Villa had made too much wine in 85. It was a huge vintage, and they had to discount to sell it. And basically, it's every time a pallet went out, they were losing money. So he took an interesting approach in that there was a vine pull at the same time. There was much more Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, etc. coming on stream. He took the approach that the company had to premiumise. So we were in receivership, and I had a very generous barrel budget, and I was extremely passionate and obsessed with what I was doing. So we really focused on producing as higher end wine as we could. And I think just after the receivership was announced, we also, in those days, New Zealand wine could enter the Canberra Wine Show, and there's 3 trophies that were available for New Zealand wine, and we picked up all 3. So there was a big marketing opportunity in receivership, but let's say Villa Maria and all the press got behind it in New Zealand. And I think George, the owner of Villa, had 4 years to buy the company back, essentially, for the receivership to be over. And he formed a new company, Villa Maria Estate, and we paid out the receivership in 2 years. So it was a pretty exciting time, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's a heck of a turnaround. And we had your friend and fellow MW, Steve Smith, on the podcast a while ago.
Hey, Smithy, yeah.
Talking about some of those years. So obviously you worked alongside each other and oversaw, that incredible period of change. As you said, when you started there, Müller-Thurgau was the main grape in New Zealand, and then Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc come on stream, and the whole picture in New Zealand changes. And during the 10 years that you were at Villa, that's knowledge that you would have had, I suppose, of regions, grape varieties and everything else, plus the brains trust that you had, you and Steve and others, must have been an incredible learning curve. What else did that trajectory hold for you?
Yeah, it was an amazing learning curve, actually, and, I had some really good people working with me. Well, I was the winemaker for Villa, and then the next year I was made the chief winemaker for the Villa Group, which included Vitals and also Esk Valley Estate, which was purchased during receivership. So it was very interesting times. And Steve joined, I think I started there in 83, he joined in 88. So we were sort of well underway with Chardonnay and Sauvignon and things then. And then we developed into Marlborough. Steve did a lot of the early work sourcing vineyards initially, and then later on setting up and planting vineyards down there. But yeah, Steve and I worked together very well. And we're still good mates to this day, actually. He was best man at he was MC at my wedding and I was best man at his or something like that. So, yeah. It was very exciting times, playing around with different things. I mean, I think John Hancock from Morton Estate made the first ever barrel fermented Chardonnay in New Zealand in 85, and I started playing around with barrel fermented Chardonnay in 86. So, this was all quite radical and new and different then. So, yeah, lots of experimental stuff. I pretty much had a free hand. George, the owner, was busy ensuring the companies survived and dealing with receivers and the banks and everything else. So I was pretty much given a free rein with the winemaking. Often I'd take a wine over and show it to him just before it was bottled, So when I think back, he was extremely trusting of someone who was really only in their mid-20s. Yeah, no, very, very exciting time. I learnt an enormous amount, not just a lot about winemaking, different vineyards. Villa didn't have any of its own vineyards. It was all contract fruit. So, I'd spent a lot of time out with Steve going around the vineyards, selecting out we were going to make the best batches out of, just winemaking stuff, really. We played around with some Botrytis Riesling in Marlborough, and we had an incredible run in the wine shows. I think because we had a free hand, we probably dominated the wine shows in New Zealand from 85, 86 onwards, I think, really.
Yeah, I think you were at Villa for around 10 or so years. You must have a lot of affection for New Zealand, given what you saw there. Has anything surprised you about the way that New Zealand wine industry has developed since you started there?
It's really just gone from strength to strength for a very long time. I mean, they've overdone it now in Marlborough. They've planted way, way more than they should have, and big companies mainly got carried away and planted too much. So at the moment, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc is there's a massive surplus. So there's going to be a few tough years, but it's taken them a long time to get to that point. I mean, the industry's been buoyant for really since the mid-80s when it was the vine pool and restructured. It's really been on an upward trajectory ever since, I think. And Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc is still popular and still sells all around the world. It's just that they've overcooked it. I don't know if you've been to Marlborough, but it used to be the main area of it. Now you can drive out the Wairau Valley for half an hour and you still can't get to the end of the vineyards. It just goes on and on and on and on. And, some of those, once you get out deep out in the valley, with later ripening, prone to frost, the frost fans everywhere, it's just, a bit of corporate greed really hasn't done them any great service.
Okay, so what happened to make you fly the coop from New Zealand after a lengthy amount of time there?
Well, my original plan was to go there for 18 months and then move on, so I sort of always had in the back of my mind to travel. I was married initially when I went there, and I think I just basically worked too hard, so that finished. And then I got married again in 91. I sat the Master of Wine in 91, so that sort of exposed me to opened my eyes to the world of wine, I suppose, more. Since about 87, 88, I was doing 2 trips a year to the UK, which was, Villa Maria only started to export. Its first exports, I think, were 89, actually, 88 vintage wines, yeah. So I was doing 2 trips to the UK each year for a fortnight, tasting a whole range of wines. Grants for St James, which was a big importing company at the time, the biggest in the UK, were our agents. So I got to meet with the buyers and sneak in on their Bordeaux tastings and just was exposed to a vast array of stuff, which then got me interested in doing the Master of Wine. So I just sort of wanted to see a bit more of the world, really. I just got married for the second time, and my wife calls it an early midlife crisis. I think I just thought, oh my God, I've got married. I had probably the premier winemaking job in New Zealand as chief winemaker for the Villa Group everything was going really well, but it was sort of, I don't know, just sort of needed something else, really. Actually, it was a tricky time. My wife thought she was marrying someone who was settled and successful, and she'd spent 7 years trotting around the world doing all sorts of things, working on kibbutzes and beaches in Greece and all the rest of it. And I thought I was marrying someone who'd be happy to up and go. So I said, right, we're off. And she said, what do you mean? So I'm not sure the marriage only just survived the first 12 months, I think. But then after that, 33 years later, we're still married. So that was good. So I think it was just, I don't know, I've always had a bit of a travel urge in me. And I think it was just, I saw myself settling in. I thought I'd go to Europe, do different things for a couple of years, and I sort of thought I might end up coming back to Villa, or back to New Zealand. But then opportunities opened up over there, and I ended up staying there for 10 years. So I leave Australia for 2 years and then come back again. The 2 turned into 20.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's have a look at how those opportunities arose and where they took you then. What was the general path at the beginning of that time?
I initially resigned from Villa, gave George 6 months' notice, obviously, because I wanted the handover to go well. I didn't have anything organised to go to. I thought during that 6 months I'll start to make inquiries. So during that 6 months I was actually approached by a UK importer called Milico, who was trying to deal in Hungarian wine, and Eastern Europe had only just opened up. He'd been taking wines into the buyer, actually, at Grants of St James, trying to sell it, and he'd said, these wines are just not, we can't sell these wines, there's just no chance. You need to get some help. And because of my involvement through Villa with Grants of St James over the years, he said, I hear Kym Milne's leaving Villa Maria, why don't you talk to him? So out of the blue, I got contacted by Hemant, who was the owner of the company, and said, would I go to Hungary and do some consulting? And I said, well, I've actually got a vintage teed up in Bordeaux, working for Hugh Ryman, who was one of the first people to do the flying winemaking. I had a vintage lined up in Montbazillac with him. I said, I can come, and do a... So they got me out for 2 weeks. It was my first consultancy gig, really. I spent 2 weeks in Hungary at Balaton Boglar Winery, which is a big winery on Lake Balaton, going around all their vineyards, going through their winery, tasting all their wines, talking with the winemakers. I wrote a report about what I thought they needed to do. And then they said, now you have to stay for the vintage and show us. And I said, well, I can't. I've got a vintage in Bordeaux. So they said, well, can you send someone over to do it? So I thought about it, and I contacted John Hancock in New Zealand, actually. And he said, I got this young guy who's really good working for me. He'd probably be interested in an overseas vintage. And that was Warren Gibson, who I'm sure you know, Trinity Hill and Belancha. So I wrote out some specifications of what I wanted to do. And we're talking pretty simple stuff. It was, the winery was under the USSR, or the Eastern Russian control, essentially. It was all about volume and price, and so their systems were rough. It was all about throughput, and quality really didn't matter at all. So we made a trial tank. Warren stayed there for the vintage, and then as soon as I finished the vintage in Bordeaux, I went back and checked all the wines with Warren. We did the blending. Well, it wasn't a lot of blending because it was a 40,000 tonne facility, and we were making, a couple of tanks of Chardonnay, a couple of tanks of Sauvignon Blanc. We made some Urché Olivier, some Solvel Tellini, and I think 1 tank of a Cabernet blend. Checked all the wines, and then the importer got the Sainsbury's buyer out. I think we made 40 or 50,000 cases of wine equivalent. The Sainsbury's buyer came out, tasted the wine, and bought the lot on the first visit. So I thought, it's not a bad, this is quite interesting, really. And then when I was in Bordeaux, there was a division of Grants of St James called International Wine Services, which was essentially the own label division, which supplied own label products to all the supermarkets and the high street chains. And they were doing a few flying winemaker projects with Jacques Lurton at the time. They decided they wanted to have an in-house winemaker, so MD of that section of the company came over to Bordeaux and said, would you be interested in working for us as a flying winemaker? And I thought, it sounds quite interesting. I'd worked for Hugh Ryman, I'd seen what he did, I'd done the Hungarian project, and I thought this could be quite interesting. I'll do this for 18 months or a couple of years and, chance to see the world. So basically they'd said, you can go anywhere in the world you like, find what you think's somewhere where you can make wine that will make it, you can make a change, you can make the wine more UK market friendly, and we'll sell it, and we'll see how that goes for a year or two. So Jane and I just discovered that we were pregnant with our first sons. We thought we need to have a base, and Jane spent plenty of time in England over the years. Her mother was Welsh, so she's got cousins and things there. So we thought, all right, we'll give that a go for a couple of years. We're about to have a baby, etc. So that's how that came about, really.
So you lived in London?
Lived in London for 5 years. We were quite productive and had 3 boys in the space of 4 years. And our semi-detached in Ealing was either do do a loft extension to fit the third child in or move out. So we then moved just east of Oxford, about an hour out of London. We bought an old rundown farmhouse, actually, on a couple of acres, which was on the Buckinghamshire-Oxfordshire border. Beautiful rolling countryside. It was a lovely place, actually. We lived there for 5 years. The company, International Wine Services, that I was mostly working with was in Beaconsfield, so it's like halfway between London and where I was living. So instead of commuting out from home to Beaconsfield from London, I was coming in from the other direction. But I actually ran my base ever since my first son was born. I based my office at home and then would just go into the IWS office as needed for meetings and board meetings and the like.
So there's a few things that I'm quite interested to sort of dig into there. One is just the general role of the flying winemaker. We've had, I suppose, that term come up an awful lot. It sort of feels like it was a real era where that was a particular thing.
Very much so.
You've got Europe at that time, some relatively new entrants into the European Union in the mid-80s, money flowing in different directions, places like Spain that's emerging from a dictatorship and a slump. You've got the Iron Curtain opening up, and presumably lots of old bits of rusty kit that doesn't work and vineyards that have fallen into disrepair, etc.
I've seen some pretty amazing wineries in Eastern Europe, I can tell you.
I bet you have. So what was that picture like, both from the kinds of jobs that you did, but I suppose, was there almost a community of you buzzing round and enjoying perhaps almost unfettered potential to turn places around and bring something interesting to a market?
Yeah, absolutely. There was, and the one that you didn't mention was South Africa, because it was just opening up post-apartheid. So South African wine hadn't been in Europe for a long time. Well, not officially anyway. There's fairly strong rumours that some of the wine coming out of Eastern Europe had arrived in bulk tankers from South Africa. But so South Africa was big. So I think IWS had originally talked to Jacques Lurton about doing something in South Africa, and then when I came on board, they said, would you do something in South Africa? That was the first project I did, was in Stellenbosch, working with 3 cooperatives down there. And I went down, looked around the industry for probably 10 days or so with someone through Lynn Sheriff. I don't know if you ever come across Lynn. She's Master of Wine in the UK. She was working for the company that we were doing it through. Ended up deciding on 3 cooperatives in the Stellenbosch area that we made wine in. I set up, what I wanted to make and etc. And I had installed Reed Boswood there for the vintage of Kaesler fame, and now his own label in the Barossa. And Bos was not long out of college and young, enthusiastic winemaker. We had full access. We could select the vineyards we wanted. Like, the co-ops had a surplus of wine. They were looking to develop more things. They wanted to get into the English market. So this was an opportunity for them. I think I went up and down about 5 or 6 times a year, probably, with South Africa for many years. Bos made the wine. I went down during vintage, helped him with vineyard selection. Probably went a couple of times that first vintage. Then after vintage, did all the blending. Then he left, and then I sort of oversaw the wine. And then I would go out with the sales guys in the UK and speak to the buyers, talk about the wine, etc. That first year we made 60,000 cases in Stellenbosch. We'd actually got Tesco to commit to half of it, subject to the quality being good enough, before we made it, and then we sold the other half at the London Wine Trade Fair. So we basically had it all committed by sort of July after vintage, really. So when that went well, we thought, right, this is good. So, next project I did was in Puglia, in the south of Italy. So that was my first Italian project, working with the Cantaloupe family, and that was, again, a winemaker. I looked around a lot of different wineries in Italy, came across the Cantaloupe family. Augusto was a progressive. He was head of the local winemakers association. He'd tasted some wines, I think, that Peter Bright, the Australian, had made in Portugal, and was impressed and was keen to work with someone from the New World. And so I think he learnt off me and I learnt off him, basically. And we made Chardonnay, Primitivo, Negromaro, a range of wines, and they all launched successfully, and we just grew it from there, really.
Very good. And just give us a sense of the relationship that you kind of develop as a flying winemaker with the UK trade, especially the supermarket trade. What's the dynamic like? I mean, they have so much influence in terms of adapting to taste, but also probably developing palates and demand for various different things, with the world at their fingertips to a certain degree, and with you as a very useful instrument with the talent to go and do the things that they needed you to do. So how does all that work, and is it a fun dynamic to work within?
Well, yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was an interesting time. The supermarket's much more dominant now than they were then. Supermarkets were certainly big players, but there was a lot more high street chains then as well. So when we were doing this, our customers were like the Sainsbury's, Tesco, Asda, Morrison's. There was even more supermarket chains then too. There was Safeway, but also we used to sell a lot of wine into the likes of Oddbins, Threshers, Victoria Wine, Peter Dominic. There must have been 7 or 8 pretty major high street chains, which are pretty much all gone now. the supermarkets are so dominant in the UK now. So we had about 20 major customers that were either high street chains or supermarkets. But yeah, the way we used to work it was I would go to a region, visit a whole lot of different wineries, try and find somewhere where I thought the vineyards had potential, the wines had potential, and often the most key thing was had a winemaker that was interested and willing to work with me. I always took the approach I was learning off him and he was learning off me, so it wasn't coming in saying, you're all ableist, this is what we're going to do. It was talking with him, working with him, because obviously if you don't get cooperation where you're working, you're banging your head against a brick wall, which I did a little bit of in Hungary when I first started, because the winemaker there was offended that they'd put somebody in. But it was very much about getting on with the people you were working with, and they benefit because they were selling wine, and so it was mostly a win-win. I mean, we had the odd case where we made wine and we didn't sell it, but it was fairly rare actually. So before we did a project, so I'd go to a region, visit a whole lot of wineries, work out who I thought I could work with, where we could actually not change things dramatically, but make the wines a bit more friendly for the market. Then I would go in and sit and talk it up with all the buyers in the UK, go and visit the different chains and the supermarket buyers, tell them about what we were planning to do. It was pretty rare we'd get a commitment out of them, but if they showed interest and we would think it was worth having a punt and doing the project, if they said, oh no, I really can't see that working, then we wouldn't do it. So we very much sounded out the market first. I would then set up a whole lot of specs, work out volumes and what we were doing, and write the winemaking specifications for each thing we were making. Employ a young winemaker from mostly Australia and New Zealand, although I had Thierry Boudinot from the south of France, did a couple of vintages in South Africa and did a fabulous job. And a South African came to Europe a couple of times. So, but it was mostly Australian, New Zealand contact. Install them for the vintage. I'd sort of fly backwards and forwards, particularly in the first year or two of a project. I'd visit quite a lot. And then once they were a bit more mature, then it was more settling the winemaker in at the start and then going back after the vintage and doing all the blending and selection. And then once all the wines were done, then I would go out with the sales team to Tesco, Sainsbury's, Threshers, Oddbins, etc. with the wines and taste with the buyer mostly. Sometimes they would want you to submit the wines and not be there, but in a lot of cases, I think because I was an Australian winemaker living in the UK and I also had a Master of Wine qualification, it did open a lot of doors, so people were interested to see what I was doing and to talk to me about the wines, and I'm sure that very much helped with the listing process.
When people talk about flying winemaking, they often talk about these technical, clean, correct wines and this updating of technology really in places. But at the same time, it sounds like it probably feeds your appetite for creativity and adventure being out there, because there was such a blank slate, but also you're finding things and bringing things to a market. So there's a real dynamism about that, isn't there, as well? Was that quite a fulfilling thing? And it probably also helped that you'd been at Villa, which had made so many huge strides in New Zealand.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it was really exciting times. I mean, we weren't making, fine wine, absolute top end, highly expensive wine. We were operating in not the bottom of the market, but we were in the sort of lower to middle market, upper middle, in that sort of area, and it was just incredibly interesting. I was making wine from grapes that I had never even heard of, even though as a master of wine you're supposed to know all these grape varieties. There's some of them that were completely new to me, Bombino, Bianco and that sort of stuff. So it was just a really interesting time. I mean, I worked like a maniac. It's a good thing I've got a very independent wife who, could cope with 3 small children while I was bombing around on an aeroplane so often. In fact, one of the boys at school, someone asked where Dad was, and they said, Dad's on an aeroplane. I think they were under the impression that when I left, I just flew around on an aeroplane for a week and then I came back again. So, it was it was hard. It was busy. It was hectic. I mean, when I started with IWS, I suppose part of the story is the reason I ended up staying 10 years is after 18 months working for IWS, we did a management buyout. So Grant St James was bought by another company called Matthew Clark, and they thought the own label division, which was International Wine Services, they were all about brands. They thought we were just a waste of time. We managed to convince them. I left the company and then consulted back to it, just sort of trying to convince them that if they didn't let us buy the company, it was going to disintegrate anyway. And so we did a management buyout. So there was 7 or 8 of us originally. It was the managing director, the finance guy, and myself. We were the main 3, and then 3 salespeople and a couple of support staff. And we were able to put a little bit of money in. We didn't have much, and then use the profits of the company to buy the company. And we had 4 years to do it, and we went like stink, and we bought it in 2. So we went from my flying winemaker projects. I think in the first year we made 60,000 cases in South Africa and maybe 50,000 in Puglia. And then each year we were adding new projects. So we went from a starting point of 0 to 2 million cases of wine, which were projects that I was looking after all around the world, it was a lot. And I ended up, I don't know if you know Alistair Mailing from in New Zealand. I employed him as a winemaker here, and he actually did his Master of Wine as well while he was in the UK. So there was Alistair and I that were permanent in the UK. He looked after half the world and I looked after the other half. And then we were employing probably 4 to 5 winemakers a year in South Africa. We were doing over 500,000 cases of wine out of South Africa for the vintage. And then about 11 or 12 winemakers across Europe each vintage. So it was pretty hectic.
Yeah, and I'm assuming as well that with all the contacts you were making, getting your projects done, but also liaising with buyers back in the UK from all your flying projects, and the way that UK market does have so many very influential voices, the press as well, I'm assuming, were really quite interested in all these new regions that were being brought to prominence in the UK. How's that sort of fed your sense of an international connection? I mean, sometimes in Australia you can feel like you're in a bit of a backwater in this sense, but I'm assuming that for a lot of your career you felt like you're kind of at the centre of everything.
Absolutely. The journalists at the time, the flying winemaker thing was quite new. Hugh Ryman and Jacques Lurton from out of Bordeaux had started doing it. Probably they'd been going a year or two by the time I started, and it was very much gave the journalists new things to write about, So I used to see the journalists quite often. I'd go to a lot of the trade tastings in London, wines of Chile tasting, wines of Argentina, etc., and bump into Robert Joseph and Tim Atkin and Jancis, and a whole array of people would be happy to talk to you. And IWS, we were importing 4 million cases of wine, of which 2 million was the flying winemaker stuff. To put that in perspective, the total off-trade was about 100 million cases. So we were basically importing 1 in every 25 bottles of wine in the off-trade in the UK came through IWS, and 1 in 50 of those was a project I was running. So there was a lot of wine spread around that the journalists were writing about, and I had built up some really good relationships with those guys, Anthony Rose and various others.
Yeah, and the names of the winemakers, your name and those that you were working with on those projects, were those beginning to be mentioned in those press reports, or were you kind of behind the scenes?
No, very much my name would get mentioned a lot. Always with the projects I did, the vast majority of them, not every wine we made would have my name on the back label. Sometimes it would be an own label Sainsbury's product that was just Sainsbury's didn't mention us. But a lot of the wines we did, we came up with our own sort of brands, which is a generous word for it, but we would come up, we'd design our own labels, come up with a name, and on the back label we would usually mention myself and the winemaker in the project. So I'd say something like Australian winemaker Kym Milne working with, say, Sicily, it was Pepe Pellegrino or Augusto Cantalet in Italy or whatever. So we tried to very much include the local winemaker in it and talk about it as a collaboration type thing. That was sort of part of the deal.
Yeah, and from there you come home at some point, obviously, because you're here now, and working in consulting. I suppose you're still travelling, or you've got your eye on several different areas. You're not exactly standing still with one thing. One of those is South Africa. You mentioned that you've still got a client there that you visit regularly. We haven't had much talk about South Africa, but we don't see much of the wines here in Australia either. What's your overall idea of what we're missing out on when we don't think about South Africa enough?
Yeah, South Africa's... It's interesting, actually. It's where I've been working, not on the projects, but since consulting, is to Rustenburg Winery in South Africa, which is in Stellenbosch. So their vineyards are on the slopes on the Simmonsig mountain behind Stellenbosch. If ever you get to go, one of the most beautiful wine estates on the planet, I think, Rustenburg. I would say climatically, Stellenbosch is not as hot as the Barossa, not as cool as the Adelaide Hills. It sort of sits somewhere in there. Make a really interesting array of wines, and there's all sorts of people doing all sorts of things in South Africa now. It's just a spectacularly beautiful wine region. When I first worked there, co-ops were still very big, and that's changed in South Africa. I mean, there still are co-ops, but a lot of them have morphed into private companies, and there's a lot more small wineries have started up, and the KWV was very dominant in the early days, and so it was basically KWV and Stellenbosch Farmers Winery were the two sort of big players there. But these days there's a vast array of small wineries doing all sorts of interesting things. There are some South African wines come in. Rustenburg, actually, their wines do come into Australia. I think they've just got a new agent in Sydney, actually. But yeah, not big quantities, but you can access them here.
And where else are you spending your time as a consultant?
I've gradually sort of wound back a lot of the overseas stuff. For a while I was doing a couple of wineries in Chile, Razaris in Valdivieso, Rustenburg in South Africa. Then I started doing Hunters in New Zealand and Craggy Range pre-COVID. So it sort of, I just decided I'd spent too much of my life on aeroplanes, so I cut back. Well, Valdivieso, the consultancy finished, and then I finished the Razaris one just because I'd picked up two in New Zealand a bit closer to home. So really, and then Craggy Range stopped when COVID came along, basically because, they do lots and lots of small batches of things, and it wasn't practical couldn't visit essentially. But Hunters kept me on, so I go to Hunters in Marlborough 2 or 3 times a year. Rustenburg has gradually morphed into, I now am on a retainer just to be available for advice and go through their barrel plans and discuss things with them. I haven't been for 2 years. I was going 3 times a year, and then after a while it was twice a year, and then this is since 2008, and then once a year for probably 5 or 6 years, and now I'm just on a retainer to be available essentially. Travel's much less than it used to be, and then what have I got, 7 or 8 clients in Australia now, but pretty much mostly in South Australia, a few in the Adelaide Hills, one in Mount Benson, Anita, that at Wangolina, and one in the Barossa. So yeah, I'm more home-based and spend less time getting on aeroplanes now. Or when I get on aeroplanes now, apart from going to New Zealand for work, it's more holidays really.
Good, you probably deserve that, and I hope that your wife's putting up with having you at home more.
Yeah, well, actually, for a while she kept asking me when my next trip was. I think she quite liked having the run of the place and not having me offering her advice.
Now, speaking of advice, for many years, that's really been your role. Then that consultant facilitating role that you played throughout Europe. Now, with all that experience you've had, what do you bring to the projects that you work in? What makes a good consultant?
My approach with consultancy is to talk to the client and find out what they want and then try and help them make what they want. So, I think there's some examples of consultants around the world where they have a style that they focus on and they try and make that style in different countries. I mean, the wines will still taste different, of course, because they're made from a different raw material, but I tend to try and talk to the client about the styles that they want to make and then try and help them make those styles. So I try not to impose my style, if there is such a thing, on all my clients. I try and help them make what they want to make, if that makes sense. And I think that's probably the best role of a consultant. I think coming in and saying, no, you have to do this, I want to make great big oaky reds, or I want to make whatever, unless you can see that there's a potential market for them. But it's talking to them about their market, their styles, what they want, and then helping maximise what they want to do. That's the way I see my role.
Yeah, and also, in a rare way, I suppose, you have seen those market conditions and how strong demand can be when you hit the mark. And I suppose you've seen some great brand builders and outlets who have really built their wine business. It's not necessarily the thing that most winemakers hang their hat on, actually, that being able to nail the market, find the place where those wines are in demand and meet that demand. Do you think that that's a really important string to your bow as a consultant too? Yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm very much conscious of, making wines that are enjoyable, drinkable. People want to do something a little bit quirkier, that's fine. Just, they need to have the market for it. If the wine you're making for a hipster bar in Melbourne is going to be quite different than what you're making if you want to sell it to Dan Murphy's, So very much it's horses for courses, really.
And when you say about your style, what is your style and what outlets have you got for your own way of doing things, and what kind of wines are they?
Yeah, my preferences do come through to some extent in what I do. I like ripe wines, but wines with elegance, not the big, heavy, over oak sort of styles. Yeah, some finesse. I think one of the things I learnt working in Europe was bigger is not better, and restraint is a really good thing. So some of my consultancies, and it varies, some of them I think, if you take oak usage as an example, some of them I think I encourage them to use a bit more oak because they're all about nothing but very old oak, and a subtle use of oak can be a plus. Others, like I do some work for a Chinese client in the Barossa, that when I joined them it was 100% American oak and 15.5 alcohol, and so I've introduced French oak. They're still making a rich style. They're targeted at China, but the alcohols are now more like 14.5. There's a lot more French oak influence, and the new oak percentages are way down on what they started. So that's what I think is going to be better. The wines are still rich Barossa styles. So they're not in the sort of lighter, brighter style, but we've had some good success with that. Picked up the IWC trophy a couple of years ago in London for Barossa Shiraz and that sort of thing. So it's about often restraining things a little bit.
And you're based in the Adelaide Hills these days. You've been to plenty of wine regions around the world, but an area, it's got its own beauty in its own right, for sure. What's it like living there? And also, as a region, what are the subtleties of Adelaide Hills that people may not know about, given that it is actually quite a varied geographical area?
It's a lovely place to live, actually. We've got an old house on 30 acres in a little town, or just outside a small town called Mylor. We're completely rural. We collect our own rainwater for drinking. There's no mains, there's no sewage. We're on septic tank, etc. It's very rural in that respect. We can leave our place, drive to the centre of Adelaide in 25 minutes. If we want to go out in the evening, if it's peak hour traffic, make that 35. So you're on the edge of a city of over 1 million people with all the positives that brings, but you're still living in the country. So it's I think the Adelaide Hills is a fabulous place to live. In terms of wine, I think it's a really interesting wine region. After my New Zealand experiences, and I like working with cool climate styles. I like working with all styles as well. I've been doing some consultancy for someone with high volume river stuff as well. So, the variety is good. But with the Adelaide Hills, it's quite a large area. It's about twice the surface area of the Barossa. It's essentially the top of the old Mount Lofty mountain range. So it runs from Kaipo in the south, borders McLaren Vale, right up to the borders of Barossa in the north. All the vineyards are between 300 and 600 metres above sea level. And in land area, the GI of the Adelaide Hills is twice the size of the Barossa. But in vineyard area, Adelaide Hills has got in the order of 4,000 hectares of vineyards, whereas the Barossa has 10,000. So the Adelaide Hills region is not like, say, the Barossa where you go and it's wall-to-wall vineyards. The vineyards are scattered. Because it's top of an old mountain range, you have all sorts of influence of slope aspects, different soil types. If you look at the growing heat degree days, so heat degree days is a fairly loose way of comparing regions, but just as an indication, if you look at what we call the growing degree days, which is the growing season for the grapes, Stirling has a very similar growing heat degree days to Dijon in Burgundy, whereas Kaipo in the south, so that's around 1200 Stirling. Kaipo in the south is around 1400. These are round figures, growing heat degree days, which is very similar to Hermitage in the Northern Rhone, or actually not much different to Napa in California. So the Adelaide Hills can make a vast array of wine styles, from really cool climate styles to still cool climate influence, but where you can ripen Cabernet easily in the northern and southern fringes of the hills, but you try and grow Cabernet in the central part of the hills, and it's very green and weedy, herbaceous. So it's a pretty diverse area, which makes it really interesting. The big influence in the Adelaide Hills is the night temperatures. So during the day in summer, we would be 2-3 degrees cooler perhaps than Adelaide than the plains. But at night, we're 10 to anything up to 14 degrees Celsius cooler, which is dramatic. So that big diurnal variation slows the ripening, certainly helps you retain acidity more, because with cold nights you don't get the respiration and your acid drop is a lot lower. And so it makes significantly different styles. Just to give you an example, the variation, I did a lot of work for many years with Bird and Hand Winery, and we used to source Shiraz from the central part of the hills at the winery, and we had some Shiraz vineyards up near Kersbrook in the northern part, just on the border of the Barossa, but still over 300 metres high. And we would pick the Shiraz from the northern part of the hills, sometimes 3.5 weeks difference than we would from the central part of the hills. So it's dramatically different. So you can make quite different styles of wine.
Yeah. I've got a feeling that if you played a word association game with a lot of wine students and international people, that if you said Adelaide Hills, Chardonnay might be the first thing to come out of their mouth.
Yes.
But as you've just mentioned, lots of different grape varieties there. What do you think are the most exciting sub-regions and grape potentials in Adelaide Hills?
I think Adelaide Hills is made for Chardonnay. I think it's a terrific region for Chardonnay. I think some people are chasing the highly reductive style a little bit much perhaps at the moment. A little bit of flinty reduction's attractive. When it's the dominant character, I object. But I've had that discussion with quite a few people of late. But I think Adelaide Hills Chardonnay's a standout. I really like Adelaide Hills Shiraz. I think it's a really good area for Shiraz. Cooler climate, but you can still have some quite rich, fleshy wines. Sometimes I've been a bit grumpy with the Adelaide Wine Show in that they tend to think Adelaide Hills has to be all cool climate, lighter bodied styles. The hills can produce a broader range than I think they award sometimes. But yeah, I think Chardonnay and Shiraz are the two, absolute winners in the hills. But I think there's a lot of other things that show a lot of potential. Gamay is becoming quite popular, and I think for a few years people have been picking Gamay too green in the hills. They think for some reason Gamay should be light, bright and a bit herby. Now that people are starting to ripen it properly, I think there's some really sensational Gamay starting to come out of the hills, and I think that will be a variety that's going to be a real focus. Quite a few people have focused on Gruner in the hills. I think it's probably a harder sell, to be honest, just because Gruner Veltliner is not necessarily the most commercially attractive name. But there's some nice Gruners being made, particularly Harndorf Hill, making some sensational wines. But there's lots of other things that do really well in the hills. There's some really good Fianos being made. People are starting to play with Nebbiolo. I think that needs to be in the warmer fringes of the hills to ripen properly. There's Aglianico, there's all sorts of things in the hills. There's a great variety. I think the most widest planted, I haven't looked actually at the numbers for a few years, but Sauvignon Blanc is the most widest planted, probably slightly more than Chardonnay, and then Pinot Noir would be next, quite a lot of which goes into sparkling. There's some really good sparkling wines being made in the hills. Deviation Road, for example, I think, one of the better sparkling producers in Australia, but also some dry red made out of Pinot as well.
I was going to say, from an Australian perspective, given that you've been for a long time an international man of mystery, you have a pretty good handle, I guess, on Australian wine and how it's seen overseas. It's very easy when you're over this side of the world to look at it in a bit of a bubble. Do we perceive it correctly? Do we give out the right messages? Are we making the right wines?
That's a minefield of a question. Look, Australia's been hugely successful overseas with export. The vast majority of what Australia exports, and I don't know the percentages, but I would guess 80% plus of what we export is from the irrigated regions. So as a consequence, I think Australia is often seen in overseas markets as great value, drinkable, quaffable, sunshine in a glass type thing. I think a lot of people are working really hard to try and premiumise Australia and get that image overseas, apart from a brief period when Parker fell in love with extremely alcoholic, over-extracted Barossa wines when Australia sold high-priced wine in the US for a short period of time. I think that's pretty much died. We suffer from the success at the cheaper end of the market to some extent. But, there's lots of people doing a lot of good work trying to build the image around the world in overseas markets. It's a complicated story, really, because you hear a lot of small producers saying, we shouldn't be making river wine, it does the industry damage, etc. But it's been the heartbeat of the Australian wine industry for a very, very long time, and I mean, they're in a terrible state now with the surpluses, and growers, a lot of growers will leave the industry and start growing pumpkins or plant almonds or whatever. So, there's going to be a real shake-up in the next few years. But I don't think you can just dismiss those regions either, because they've been the bedrock of Australian success for a very long time.
Yeah. Do you think as well that there is a disconnect between what winemakers want to grow, what they like to drink, and what the market wants?
Yeah, well, certainly in some cases. Obviously, that's a pretty difficult question as well. But if winemakers are making their wine that they want to make and they're selling it successfully, then no, there isn't really a disconnect. But yeah, in some cases, people tend to get fixated with the style. I think wine industry is very much about fashion and, the pendulum swing. Like we used to make great big sunshine in a glass over oak Chardonnay, and that swung back completely the other way, and we went, in my opinion, went way too lean, sort of Yarra-led green apple sulphide-driven Chardonnays. And I think the pendulum now, thankfully, is swinging back where people are trying to sit somewhere in between those two. I think sometimes the industry leads the fashion more than consumer, and then they discover the consumers perhaps doesn't like that quite so much, and they move back again. So
to that point, a lot of the consumers that you've been servicing over the years unashamedly like wines that are quite ripe, potentially quite fruity. And in terms of how the wine growing conversation is led here, it's very focused on cool climate styles. Even things that aren't cool climate paint themselves that way. Perhaps those wine styles are leaner and less consumer friendly, perhaps, than things that you've dealt with. That's, I suppose, where I'm coming from with that idea that you might have seen a more balanced picture of what people like to drink as opposed to what we talk about.
I mean, it depends which part of the market you're operating in. Certainly in the higher volume ends of the market, then bright, fresh, fruity, etc. is still a winner. I think as you get into the finer wine, higher end markets, then there's room for more interest, more complexity, more variation in style, as long as the winemaker can talk to it and promote it and tell a story. A lot of it's about the story you can tell and the people you can get interested in your style once you get into the sort of the finer wine end of the market.
So what about Cabernet? Is that undersold here?
Yeah, Cabernet, it's probably 15, 20 years ago, it was was like really rated in Australia, it seems to have, with the consumer, seems to have lost its way a bit somehow. Regions like Coonawarra that make some stunningly good Cabernets are struggling with too much Cabernet, and just seems to have lost its way a little bit. I mean, there's some great wines being made in Australia out of Cabernet, particularly coming out of Margaret River and Coonawarra, but there's also quite a bit of Cabernet floating around that can't find a home at the moment as well. So,
but again, from your UK wheeler-dealer kind of brain, would you say that that's because of a gatekeeping issue, a commentator issue, rather than an actual wine quality or desirability issue?
I don't think it's about wine quality generally. I think the Australian Cabernet quality is extremely good. I think it's potentially gatekeeper and just, fashions change, fashions move. It's trying to work out why sometimes it can do your head in. You've just got to sort of watch them and follow them in some cases.
Yeah, so over the years then, you've had a vastly interesting career from beginnings that didn't look like they were pointing in this direction, from a small country town and a teetotal family. You've had an extraordinarily varied wine career. Has it surprised you the way that life has turned out?
I think you find a passion, and if you follow a passion, things hopefully fall into place. I mean, I've been very lucky in my career. I think I've been in the right place at the right time. I think once I've had the opportunities, I've really worked extremely hard to make them successful, but I was lucky to be at that point in time and that place at that time to have those opportunities. So look, the wine industry's been terrific for me. I've had a really interesting life so far, and hopefully will continue to do so. It's certainly satisfied my travel bug, which I think I've always had a bit of a wanderlust for moving around. Although these days I satisfy it as much by doing hiking holidays. My wife and I are off over 3 years walking the GR5 in Europe, which is a 2,200k trek, which we did a first third last year. So, sorry, wandering off the track. No pun intended. But the wine industry's been fantastic for me. My eldest son now has entered the wine industry, which I get a lot of pleasure from. He's the chief winemaker at the Lane Winery in the Adelaide Hills. In fact, I consult to the Lane, so that's quite an interesting dynamic. But touch wood, he seems to be able to tolerate me, and it seems to be working well.
Yeah, right. I hope he listens to you more than my sons listen to me.
Well, he does seem to with wine to some extent, but more so than life in general, perhaps.
Okay, so last question, Kym, then. With all this wisdom that you've picked up over this career, what do you think in this tricky time for the world in general, but tricky time for wine as well, what do you think is important? What's wine given you that you'd like other people to experience as a well-rounded, fulfilled human being?
I just think wine's, it's a source of pleasure, really, isn't it? It's used sensibly, it's a wonderful social stimulant. It's extremely pleasurable, and if you've got the passion for it, it's incredibly satisfying. It's clearly not everybody's cup of tea, but it's just given me a really interesting life, I think. I mean, it's just such an interesting topic. There's such incredible variety of place, of style, of variety, of... Like, I've made wine all around the world. I've studied and done the Master of Wine, tasted wine from all around the world. And I still come across... I judged, actually, with you at the Alternative Varieties wine show last year in Mildura, and came across a couple of varieties I'd never heard of. I mean, how amazing is that? There's not many food industries you could be in that you could do that, really. No,
as you say, place, style, variety, and personality too. You must have come across quite a few.
Absolutely, yeah. The wine industry is full of all sorts of interesting people. I don't get on many of them, but I managed to get on some of the Master of Wine trips, where we get hosted to a certain country and learn stuff. And there's some wonderfully interesting people in that group. Generally, not all, but the majority of them quite humble, passionate, and really interestingly quirky people, which they would probably put me in the same boat, I suppose.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for additional editing, and to my guest, Kym Milne, MW. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.